ahead and start with them. Okay. All right, so I'll just jump straight in, and hopefully that should quieten everybody up.
So welcome to the workshop on current trends in radicalization and de-radicalization. Still a relevant topic following all these years. If I might share this with you based on my own experience, in the case of Spain, we at the Elcano Royal Institute a particular interest in knowing what are the factors which allow us to best understand why some individuals undergo a radicalization process while others don't. And for that matter, we collected about 100 data on over 100 variables. And interestingly, and don't want to go beyond this at this moment, interestingly, there were only two variables or two categories within these two variables which affected at least 60% of the individuals. One of the variables was exposure to a radicalizing agent, more often in person than online. So the role of a radicalizing agent was extremely important. And the other factor, which exists in no less than 60% of the cases, was that of before starting the radicalization process, have a relative, a close friend, already radicalized, or who started previously the radicalization process. So this joint effect, this differential association impact between, on the one hand, the action of a radicalizing agent, and on the other hand, pre-existing social ties based on friendship and kinship mainly, was found to be critical. On the side of the de-radicalization, the only thing I would like to share with you is that following these years, as from the moment when Spain adopted initiatives to tackle this issue, there's only one area, I just mentioned this with several colleagues a few minutes ago, there's only one area where we found some success in de-radicalizing individuals who already adopted ideas justifying violence and, in particular, terrorism. And that area was the area of juvenile offenders. The ratio of deradicalization among juvenile offenders who were arrested for jihadist crimes was or is at this moment of nearly 50% of the total. But I'm just speaking about individuals who at the time of arrest were 18 or under. Having said so, and beyond this very narrow approach from a case study, we have a set of contributors today likely to turn this session in a fruitful and excellent one. A timely session almost every year, but this year perhaps particularly so because of Alex's recent reflections on a document that he well documented, perhaps the best known document on radicalization and deradicalization that he already published. Was it 2013, if I am correct, right? So in addition to inviting you to read his reflections 5 years later, I will be asking the first contributor to this workshop to come and take this place, and she is Teresa de Almeiida Silva, Associate Professor at the Institute of Social and Political Science at the Universidad de Lisbon, who is also coordinator of the Center for the Studies on Terrorism and Counter-Terrorism at ICCT Lisbon. Teresa, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Teresa. I came from Universidad de Lisboa, from the Institute of Social and Political Sciences, and I'm going to talk. To talk about lone wolf terrorism, particularly the Islamic one, and the specific case of Muslim minorities in Europe. This is my definition of lone wolf, and this is a technique that seems to be increasingly used by Muslim terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda or Daesh, and this seems to prove that the fight against terrorism is having some results because these terrorist organizations have to look for new techniques to continue to carry out their actions. However, it should be recalled that this is not an exclusive phenomenon of Islam. We have some examples of lone wolf terrorists. We have, for instance, Breivik, that is an origin Christian from the far-right wing. And if we go back on history, we can read what Mikhail Bakunin, during the period of anarchist terrorism, defended some single fighters against the Russian government. And we have some examples from Islam. Hassan al-Qaili in 2004, an Iraqi-American citizen. Mohamed Merah, a French young guy that was responsible for the Toulouse attacks in 2012 in Toulouse, of course, and the Tsarnaev brothers, responsible for the attack to the Boston Marathon in 2013. Well, what about the Muslim communities in Europe? During a great part of the history, Islam inspired several Western civilizations, whether in science, whether in the fields of art and architecture. There was a certain civilizational balance, yet about 200 years ago, that balance changed. At the beginning of the 20th century, most Muslim countries were colonies. Their society and their institutions were under European domain. This situation made them return to the religion path, giving them the opportunity to organize nationalist movements which end up leading them to independence. With the end of the World War II, Europe was centered in itself and worked in its reconstruction. The European colonies, on their side, start giving signs of some emancipation, and during the 50s and the 60s, those independences were being achieved, of course, not without previous facing the firm opposition of the colonial powers. Europeans saw in the former colonies the source of the necessary labor force that would allow them to regain the energy from before. Thus, the opening of borders and the fast economic growth that influenced the formation in 1957 of the European Economic Community contribute to many migrants from other countries to become the main labor force in the more developed European countries. And the choice of the hosting country was made according historical and geographical motivations. So today in the United Kingdom, it is possible to find a large Pakistani community. In France, the Algerians make up the majority of the Muslim community because of the geographical proximity. In Italy, the Tunisians the main, and in Spain, the Moroccans represent the majority of the Muslim community. In Germany, the Turkish community stands as the majority of Muslims. While they were under European rule, the Muslim countries shaped their institutions, mirroring those of the colonial countries. Today, that scenario changed, given the Islamization of Europe, that makes some authors speak about a real and effective Arabia. In these maps, you can see the growth of the Muslim population, comparing 2016, and then some projections to 2050. This one. It is a huge increase. The goal to Islamize Europe is not only coherent from the current point of view, but clearly proclaimed and broadcast in the bosom of European Muslim communities, without the correspondent opposition of the European governments. And this is a true geopolitical dispute which aims to control the Islamic immigration. This growing Islamization of Europe is sponsored by 5 major poles: Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, Islamized Turkey, and the Muslim Brotherhood, and is seen by the more radical Muslims as the ideal way to return the de-Christianized Europe to the true path of faith. Nevertheless, the Muslims' struggle to define the role of religion as in their own society is as ancient as the faith itself. It has been a struggle that resides in the interpretations of the sacred law. Some Muslims believe that Islam supports democracy and promotes human rights. Others believe Islam sanctions their own authority, and the latter seem to be the focus of the terrorism threat in the West. Islamic radicals, they accuse Europeans of having drawn new borders in the Middle East. They argue that Islam and Muslims have been constantly humiliated, and they claim that Muslims must unite and stand up for their faith. Some of the Muslim communities established in the European countries identify themselves more and more with this radical message of Islam. The shift in the gravitational center of the radical Islamic activities from the Arab Muslim world to Europe is fruit of the success of the Muslim governments in limiting radical Islam. The fundamentalist Muslims who defend open confrontation with established order failed and were firmly prohibited to continue their struggle in their countries. Therefore, they installed themselves in the West. There, they found the freedom of speech that had been denied and the means required to keep sending their radical messages. Lots of them set course to Europe, making research the myth of the conqueror Islam, the myth of the Islamic reconquest of Europe. Some of the members of the Muslim Brotherhood cut their beards and settled themselves in Europe. Lots of those who are considered Islamic terrorists by the European security forces are in fact European citizens, born within Islamic families integrated in Europe, and don't seem to feel displaced from society. On the contrary, they seem to feel fully integrated. Yet, once their parents fall apart from religion, they want to get closer to it. thanks to European mosques, where often the messages conveyed are more radical than they would be in Muslim countries, and thanks to internet, they keep close to the religion. They know it's their parents, but they do not know what it is. And many times in mosques and the internet, they come in contact with radical activism. They start believing that Europe that saw them reborn, previously under Muslim rule, should return to the path, and that its re-Islamization is an historical imperative. We cannot forget that the attacks in Paris in 2015 and in Brussels in 2016 were made by some young French and Belgians. These young people, caught in the complexities of globalization, find other activists who share the same ideals and the same values. This way, they begin to conceive reconquist plans and unite strengths against Europe and consequently against the world. They form such a synergy that the societies that hosted them start to fear them and worry about their own security. The terror is real and may attack us from inside. So reinforcing security at the borders may not be the ideal solution to stop Islamic terrorism in the West, because they attack us in our own home from inside. One of the talked solutions to try to avoid that Muslim communities spread around the world become a focus of dissemination of international terrorism might pass by the adoption by the receiving countries of policies of integration of those migrants. Nevertheless, reality shows that there has been a growing difficulty for the planned integration of those migrants. If in the past, integration emerged as a spontaneous and natural phenomenon of migration, once it is the logical consequence of acceptance by the hosting country without the need of intervention of public powers, nowadays, on the contrary, there are several obstacles to integration that compel the states to intervene, pragmatizing public policies, whose one of the consequences seems to be segregation attempts, discrimination, social exclusion, and xenophobia towards migrants. These difficulties of integration are the result of several circumstances that the states have been trying to overcome, such as the rhythm of the economic growth is slower than in preceding times, the worse quality of a great part of jobs occupied by migrants, the attitude of resistance of some European societies concerning migrants, and the adverse social climate resulting of public policies of control and fight against illegal immigration. On the other side, many times are the Muslims themselves that avoid integration. Many consider that Western values that influence mainly younger are prejudicial. Therefore, they try to raise a protection wall between themselves and modernity in order to remain pure and be able to return to their roots. In the particular case of Europe, Muslims don't want to be like Europe. They want to return to the pure foundations of Islam. They don't want to be assimilated by European identity. They want to be more Muslim. They want to modernize Islam on the Islamic way. Hence, the struggle that has been fought in some European countries in order to not give up the use of the scarf by women. The scarf is not a symbol of a political party nor a movement. It is, according to their perspective, the symbol of Muslim identity. Notwithstanding, if there is will by the host countries to well implement integration policies, if Muslim communities manifest their will to fully integrate into societies that receive them, and if that integration is made without any type of discrimination, maybe, and I underline maybe, the Muslim community spread around Europe may be a break to the expansion of international terrorism, Islamic terrorism. But we cannot forget that today the world is a smaller place. The ideas travel among peoples and borders more freely. Battles, once far away, have some consequences over the peoples in the entire world. And although some conflicts strike Muslims in Middle East, Africa, or Asia, thanks to the Islamic solidarity, also strike Muslims in Europe and in America. The combat is not only of those in the front line, but of all Muslims, because the Ummah tries to be one, in spite of its heterogeneity. In this sense, we think the full stop of Islamic terrorism in Europe may be far, far, far away from being achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Teresa, for this comprehensive overview and concise overview on the problem of violent radicalization leading to terrorism, particularly among Muslims and in our Western European context. Teresa's contribution is the first of the 5 that we have today, and the second one comes from Professor London, who is a professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the UCLA. Professor London, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure for me to be here. I've been newly recruited to the field, not through the internet, but through my very best friend who has been working in the field since it actually started. And as a newcomer to the field, I'll be talking about some technology that may not be as familiar to all of you as some of the things that you've heard about. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about brain imaging as an approach to help us in the counter-radicalization effort. And quick question about how to advance the slide. This one. Thank you very much. So as we heard in at least one of the sessions earlier today, there's an information war, and we're losing the information war. And at this moment, the terrorist recruitment model is now heavily reliant on social media, Facebook, Twitter, all these wonderful things. And in recognition of the importance of technology, in 2001, the United States Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, established a special task force on terrorism and deterrence to recommend technological approaches to deal with the issue. And most recently, the National Defense Authorization Act authorized counter-messaging operations for the U.S. Special Operations Command. And in this effort to develop the very, very best, most effective counter-messages, I believe that we can utilize the benefits of non-invasive brain imaging. And I'll talk to you a little bit about functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is the technique that I'm advocating. And I think that we need to recognize that the field of advertising has been combined to some extent with the field of cognitive neuroscience in order to develop the very, very best kinds of messages, the most effective ones that will work for the purpose that the individual wants to address. And it's really not intuitive to know what the very best kind of message would be or how to present it to an individual. Because you might think, for example, that if you have images that are very sensorially evocative and stimulating, they might be associated with the most effective messages. And using functional magnetic resonance imaging, for example, it was shown that that's not the case. The messages that are linked to highly emotionally or even visually stimulating messages are not remembered. What's remembered is the feeling associated with the stimulation, or the stimulating part of the message, but not necessarily the message that's associated with it. And some of you may have seen some of the messaging that was really put in terms of visual advertising in the anti-smoking campaign in the United States. And you've perhaps seen the image of somebody with his larynx removed, smoking out of his throat. And the idea was that that would evoke the feeling of someone wanting to quit smoking. Well, it really didn't. A lot of survey information showed that what happened is that individuals viewing these messages felt tremendous sadness and empathy for the person who was pictured, but didn't really think about quitting smoking. So we really need some way to perhaps find counterintuitive approaches that would help us deliver the best messages possible. And so here is a picture of an MRI scanner, and you have an individual in the scanner, and while in the scanner, the person can wear goggles, and through the goggles view still images or video images and can respond. And the response is seen as a picture of what's going on inside his brain. And so, for example, this hotspot is an area of the brain that's highly active when the individual is in the scanner and being tested. Now, just in case you don't know about the magic about how functional magnetic resonance imaging works, I'll just give you a little introduction. So if you think about our brain runs on oxygen. So we burn oxygen whenever different parts of our brain are active. And if different parts of the brain are active at any particular time, they need more oxygen. And blood flow is the slave of brain function and brings lots of oxygen to the area that needs to be activated. But blood flow brings more oxygen than is needed, and so there's an excess of oxygenated hemoglobin, which is paramagnetic. And this paramagnetic concentration of oxygenated hemoglobin shows up on the MRI scanner as a hotspot. Now, I come from the field of addiction research, and an awful lot has been learned from addiction research and functional magnetic resonance imaging that's relevant to the problem that we'd like to address here. So, for example, we know that the brain will process input without awareness, without a person's awareness. And this study that was done with individuals who are dependent on cannabis, where they were presented with images inside the scanner of different varieties, showed the activation and response to the stimuli. So when comparing cannabis-related as compared with neutral stimuli, they showed activation in this area, which is shown in different slices. This is the ventral striatum, or it's sometimes referred to as the pleasure center of the brain. And there's also activity in a part of the cortex called the insula, which tells the person that something is going on. There's some internal arousal. When people were viewing sexually related stimuli, they again saw activation in the nucleus accumbens ventral striatum, just as with the cannabis-related images, something that would be pleasurable to them, and also activation in the insula, indicating that there's some internal state going on in relationship. But when they were viewing aversive images, they showed no activation in the ventral striatum, no pleasure center activity, but the insula, as in the other cases, was activated. And this was when the people were viewing masked images. This was below their awareness. And so that there were these images that were either related to cannabis, sexual activity, or some objectionable activity were presented very quickly in a series of images where there were longer presentations of other images, and they weren't really aware of what they were looking at or what they were feeling. We also know that fMRI can predict behavior change. And again, from the field of addiction, there was an fMRI study of an anti-smoking campaign. And what happened was there are content-specific representations of what the person is feeling or thinking in response to the stimuli, specifically in this little green area, part of the prefrontal cortex. And what happened was when asking the people how they felt and actually monitoring their smoking behavior after the experiment when they were viewing these images, their self-report was enhanced tremendously by the information from the brain image in terms of predicting what they actually were going to do. So fMRI could theoretically be useful in predicting the response to counter-radicalization messages. We also know that the resistance to change a person's belief is related to activity of the prefrontal cortex. And in this series of studies, each one of these dots represents the reaction in response to a particular idea. The dots that are in green represent ideas that are related to hot topics, jihad, things that people, can really be passionate about, and the blue dots represent cold topics like Thomas Edison was a scientist. And what you can see is that different parts of the prefrontal cortex, on the top, the little red spot is in the left orbitofrontal cortex, and in the bottom, it's another area of the medial prefrontal cortex. What you see is that the signal is correlated with the person's resistance to change their belief. But it's not just these surface areas of the brain that are important in telling us how a person is responding to a message, but the resistance to change a message is highly correlated with activity in areas of the brain that are not easily measured by surface techniques, such as, for example, the electroencephalogram. And in particular, the two areas that are noted here is one of them is the insula, which is part of the cerebral cortex, but it's not on the surface, and the amygdala, which is the center of the brain that is very, very important in emotional processing and emotional response. So we're really just starting on a new project, and the goal of the project is to develop some empirical data to guide the development of counter messages. We want to identify the features of a message that would make it more appealing for the intended subject and might enhance the likelihood that the message will be viewed, that the message will be remembered, and that it would actually change a person's belief or affiliation. And affiliation and belief are both very important aspects of radicalization, as we know that individuals are often recruited when they really need to be attached to something. And the approach that we're going to be using is, first of all, to have a proof of principle study in a fairly large sample recruited in the greater Los Angeles area. These are not necessarily people who are destined to become radicalized, but we're going to focus on young adults who are very dependent upon social media, 18 to 25 years old. And we're going to sample a very large sample at first using Mechanical Turk, which will allow us to query 1,500 people very quickly. And the idea is that the first approach would be to identify within the population that we're testing what themes will engender tremendous feelings of affiliation or very strong belief. And we're going to be presenting still images as well as videos. And the themes that are going to be tested are geopolitics, discrimination, religious signs, war crimes, how do you feel about Trump, these kinds of things. And that will give us, from a larger set of perhaps 15 themes, 6 that will really be important to the population that we'll be sampling. The next step is going to be an in-laboratory assessment of a smaller group, and here we're going to be bringing people into UCLA where we're going to really focus on individualizing messages for each person based on his response, primarily through functional magnetic resonance imaging, but also through psychophysiological measures that will be taken at the same time. The person will be in the scanner, he'll be viewing stimuli, and we will be taking these online measurements. And then we can use multivariate statistics to identify the latent variables from all of the measures and determine the extent to which the fMRI enhances our ability to identify how strong a response is to a message, and then, of course, to what extent that message can be changed by varying the response. Now, while the person is in the scanner, the series of stimuli that he will be viewing are going to vary along different dimensions so that we'll know which dimensions are the ones that make a difference in terms of the person's affiliation or possible change in the affiliation. The kinds of dimensions would be whether the message is coming from their parents, whether the message is coming from their peers, those sorts of things. And so the question is, what's actually new here? And what's new is that we're taking cognitive neuroscience combined with advertising approaches and really addressing the defense mission of the United States government. The focus here is going to be on emotionally charged messages with content that's related to political, religious, or other moral affiliative beliefs. And the idea is that this will form the basis for evaluating the effects of counter messages to radicalization in a population that will later be selected, where we will use these techniques in this proof, developed in this proof of concept experiment. And there's an ongoing discussion about how to identify the population who will ultimately be studied, how to recruit them. Will we, in fact, go to sites that are known recruitment sites and be allowed to have messages inserted? Will we, in fact, have an approach to draw people into a fake site that we might develop that would be especially geared to what these young people who become radicalized might be interested in? And we're looking forward to working through this phase 1 initial proof of concept, and then later on into this this study with a more appropriate or more targeted population. So the idea that I'd like to leave you with is that understanding the mechanisms that underlie the responses offers a powerful approach to design social media messages that hopefully could change hearts and minds. And I'd like also to let you know that this effort is going to be a joint collaboration between our laboratory at UCLA and the ICT team, to whom we're very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor London. Not very common in meetings on radicalization to have contributions other than those coming from social sciences, sociology, psychology, political science, history, criminology. So this contribution from cognitive neuroscience seems to be relevant and most welcome in the effort to make counter messaging a more effective tool addressing violent extremism. Now, as I understand, Professor Randall Rogan is now approaching the topic of today's workshop from a communication-based approach perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. 15 minutes should do. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. So, which one is the? I've got to put my glasses on.
The first one is the ICCT.
Got it. Got it. Excellent. I'm sorry. I might have you. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. My name is Randall Rogan. I'm a professor at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And yes, I'm a communication professor, but I'm looking at motivations for radicalization and violent extremism. I'm going to be looking at it, as I'm going to describe it here today, I'm going to be superficially deep. I'm not going to get into the deep philosophical discussions that undergird what I'm going to be talking about, but my interest today is in trying to offer you, through a discussion, my talk, about potential primal motives for violent extremism, and what might be at the basis of why someone becomes susceptible to radicalization. Now, for years we've been asking this question: why do people become radicalized? What is it about the radicalization process? How does it work? And we've had a number of different explanations over the years that highlight social, cultural, and material rewards, economic, political repression, strategic choice, an eschatological ideology, a radical ideology, to psychopathology. And we heard some of the results the other day on Monday from ICT's cooperative investigation with the Israeli Prison Authority on the lone wolf in their interviews. My focus today, and my question is really, what makes a person susceptible? Is there some underlying motive? Is there really a potential silver bullet to all of this that will answer the question for us as we look at the messages? And so I'm pleased to follow Professor London, who spoke about messages, because I'm interested in, is there something in the messaging that is appealing to a specific need, a basic human motivation and need, that undergirds why people become engaged in violent extremism and then leads them into the path of radicalization and violence and terrorism. So we've had these different explanations, these different arguments and perspectives on violent extremism and radicalization, but they really only tap into a single dimension. Is there something that transcends all of these? And I'm going to argue that potentially, I don't say I have an answer, and I can't claim that these are my answers per se, because I'm not the author of the perspectives. I'm just trying to bring them to light around and studying the messaging. And so what I'm going to be looking at and talking about today are two theories, two theoretical perspectives, the quest for significance theory and terror management theory. And I want to lay those out for you. And as I say, I'm going to be superficially deep. I'm just going to scratch the surface of these puppies. I'm not really going to be getting into them. There's not going to be a quiz afterwards. You know, as a professor, it's typical. All right, take notes. Let's have a quiz. Close your computers, cell phones, in airplane mode. Not going to ask that of you here today because everyone's important and getting emails and texts. So I'll try to keep your attention. I'm going to show you a couple of videos in a moment. What is quest for significance theory? Quest for significance theory is a theory that has been developed by researchers at the University of Maryland. The lead researcher is Eric Kruglansky. And according to this particular perspective, we as human beings seek significance, a sense of significance about ourselves, that we are someone of value, that we are worthy, that we exist, that we are important. Now, this quest for significance, and I'm not going to go into the deep philosophical 17th century basis for this that comes out of a notion of love of self and self-love. The element of significance can only come, and the being deemed significant can only come from others. Others attribute that significance to us. It's not something that we have innately. It's not something that we have independent of others. And an example I like to use to highlight this is, if you've ever seen the movie Stranded with Tom Hanks, where he was isolated on a deserted island, he creates an other out of his soccer ball. He creates the other Wilson to provide him with a sense of acknowledgement and an identification of worth and value coming from his soccer ball that he names Wilson. So this sense of significance, as I say, comes from other people, deeming us worthy of being alive, of being someone. Now, we get it also a little bit by comparing ourselves to others. Now, it becomes most salient, our quest for significance becomes most salient through three essential prompts. One, through the loss of significance, that we perceive that we've lost significance, through the perceived threat to our significance, and through the perceived opportunity to gain significance. Now that highlights, those three factors or those three elements will make our quest for significance salient and forefront for us. Now, for individuals, this is on the individual level, and with individuals whose identity is strongly linked to a group, these three same factors, loss of significance to the group, threat of significance loss to the group, and perceived significance gain to the group, will also prompt the individual to pursue significance and engage in certain types of behaviors to achieve that. One of the greatest threats to significance is the threat of death, is our awareness of our own mortality and the consequence that we presume or that we believe that when we die, that's it. That's it, there's nothing more. And that our life has had no meaning, we've had no significance to our life, that we're just gonna simply be forgotten and we're going to dust, and that's it. Forgotten completely. And that now brings me to the issue, the question, and the theory of terror management. Terror management theory is really about that issue of being aware of our own death. This comes out of the work, terror management theory comes out of the work of a cultural anthropologist by the name of Ernst Becker, who started this work many years ago. He proposed that we as human beings suffer from an existential conundrum and existential dualism. Our existential conundrum is that we, on one level, are physical beings with physical bodies that are subject to the same vagaries of physicality and deterministic boundedness as all other animals. Yet, we possess as humans the cognitive capacity to think about the past, the present, and the future. We have the ability to transcend cognitively, mentally, time and space. But yet we're bogged down, we're tied down by this animalistic nature that we one day are going to die. We are going to die. Wow. But yet we think, Can we really? Does the world exist without me? Or is it going to continue on? We think, according to this theory, that we are the center of the universe. And according to Becker's belief, this highlights humankind's narcissism, that we are at heart narcissists, and that we believe that we ourselves, are humankind. We are humankind. We are the world, not in the good sense of the music, but we are the world. We are the heroic one. We are the hero. And we see this manifest in certain individuals. We can see this, for example, who have the hero syndrome, like Adolf Hitler, for example, believe that they are the Messiah, the hero who is going to save the world of its ills. Well, according to this perspective then, what happens is this gives rise to this awareness of our death. This consciousness gives rise to a terror about our own mortality, a great fear of our death, that we're ultimately going to occur. And as a consequence, we seek ways to provide ourselves with a sense of significance, going back to significance theory here for a moment. And the way that we do this is we create symbolic systems, structures, messages of how we live our lives. And those messages, those systems, are what are known as cultural worldviews, beliefs, ideologies. And if we live our life according to those cultural worldviews, we will achieve significance in two important ways, beyond being defined as being significant by others. One, we will achieve symbolic immortality, and two, literal immortality. Symbolic immortality is being remembered. For professors, it's about getting our names and publications on books and how many books are remembered, right? And for others, it's names on buildings, street signs, things of that sort. Symbolic immortality, we are remembered, right? Our life, people are going to remember us. Maybe a monument for us, who knows? Literal immortality is the belief that we will achieve life after this life. There is an afterlife, there is a paradise. So we strive for this, and if we achieve significance according to our cultural worldview, the way to live, we will be significant and we'll achieve immortality. Now, the two are not mutually exclusive. We can pursue both and achieve both at the same time, and I'll show you how in a moment. Now, failure to achieve significance in our life, in our quest for immortality, and we see this by certain individuals, and we listen to some of the reports and results, can result in alienation. Alienation from our social system, alienation from the cultural worldview in which we live, our society, our social group. Additionally, an individual may rebel against their cultural worldview. We see this often in teenagers and young adults, of rebelling against what it means to be successful, to achieve significance according to the dominant social structure and cultural worldview. This can also lead to alienation. And we know that alienation from research on stages of radicalization is typically identified as the first step in the radicalization process. Well, if we don't achieve success by our own cultural worldview, we may strive to adopt an alternative cultural worldview. Now, this focus on death, this concern on death, is predominant in Islamist jihadist ideology and materials. I was interested in the messages and asking the question, is there something in the messages that are produced by Islamist jihadist entities that is appealing to a particular need? In this case, how is it appealing to the need for significance and the concern about death and mortality? And let me show you a sample video, and I'll talk about this and dissect this in a moment.
For the sake of Allah, we will march to the gates of the paradise where our maidens await. We are men that love death just as you love the night. We're the soldiers that fight in the day and the night. We're the soldiers that fight in the day and the night. Going forth, preparing to roar, are the brothers of light with kuffar inside. Their ranks are many and weapons are heavy, but soldiers of Allah are more than ready. Soldiers of Allah are more than ready. For the sake of Allah, we will march through the gates of the paradise where our maidens await. We are men that love death just as you love your life. We're the soldiers that fight in the day and the night.
So, clearly what we're seeing here is a video that promotes killing, right? Extremely violent, extremely graphic. It's about killing. And what we see is that when a group's cultural worldview, and part of what we hear here is that within Islamist ideology, that there's a sense, an ideology or a narrative of victimization and humiliation, and that the cultural worldview of Islam is being denigrated by non-Muslims. What we see is that if that's the case, that individuals will run to defend their group's cultural worldview. And one way of doing that is by killing, destroying alternative worldviews. And as Margaret Crenshaw had noted, sacrifice for the cause is both personally redemptive and a mark of honor. It's a way of beginning or becoming a hero and part of an exalted group. Now, what is the message appealing to here? I would argue, in looking at ISIS, Dabiq publications, as well as online videos and graphics, verbal and nonverbal linguistic cues, messages in their materials, there's a clear death narrative, profound death narrative. But what is the message appealing to? It seems to be appealing to this concern about mortality and immortality. And I would argue that that is the case here, that it's providing the necessary ideology or cultural worldview for the individual to kill, but also to address their own primal need of significance and concern for immortality. And what is interesting here, I would argue, is that it actually provides the individual, if you join in and are recruited, you are promised paradise. And at the same time, you are promised heroic status. Now, what does that achieve? What does that help you to realize? Literal immortality, symbolic immortality. You are now someone who is going to be remembered. And that gives you, the individual, ultimate control over your existential destiny. Wow. So on one level, it seems sort of contradictory, doesn't it? It's about death and dying, but going and dying and killing yourself or being killed in the process actually gives you control over your existential destiny by promising you both literal and symbolic immortality. Sadly, this is not limited to ISIS. Share another one. A couple short clips with you.
ولا يعلمون أن الشعب الفلسطيني قد طور من موته ومن بحثه على الموت، ولذلك أصبح الموت عند الشعب الفلسطيني صناعة تجيده النساء، تجيده كل من في هذه الأرض، يجيده الشيوخ، يجيده المجاهدون، ويجيده الأطفال. لذلك شكلوا دروعا بشرية من النساء والأطفال والشيوخ والمجاهد، يقولون للعدو الصهيوني إننا نحرص على الموت كما تحرصون على الحياة.
One more.
أنت بوعيك حكيت عن الشهادة كشيء جميل، أنت بتعتقد إنه شيء جميل؟
الشهادة كتير شيء جميل جدا جدا، كل الناس بتتمنى الشهادة.
أيوه.
لأنه يعني إيش في أحلى من إنك تروحي على الجنة.
طب مين أفضل؟ السلام مع وجود حقوق كاملة للشعب الفلسطيني ولا الشهادة؟
الشهادة. أنا أخذ حقي بعدين أستشهد، لأنه بدنا نعيش إحنا طفولتنا حياتنا.
Sadly, it is not limited to recruitment of individuals to join ISIS. We see an indoctrination of children, as we see here, that the focus on death, providing a narrative about death that promises immortality and thereby provides control over one's destiny, existential destiny. Now, this quest for significance and quest for immortality must be aligned, must be matched with a particular ideology. And sadly, what we see, contemporary Islamist, radical, violent fundamentalist ideology provides a foundation for that, provides a quest for significance where the individual can be recruited into, becomes potentially susceptible to that based on their need. And I'm not saying it's salient for all of us. Those of us who are successful or significant in our lives do not have that need as salient. What was interesting to me in hearing some of the results from the ICCT study with the Prison Bureau were two things, two summary data points that stuck out to me that I think highlight this and relate to this. One was the high level of suicidal ideation that was articulated by many of those that they interviewed. Many wanted to die. Some of the methodology sounded a lot to me like it was a desire of suicide by cop, right? Not wanting to do it themselves because it's a sin, but having police or military kill them. So it was a high desire to die. But what was really profound to me, and I think highlights the significance and the potential applicability of this particular perspective, is how the number one deterrent, I believe was 43% or nearly 50% of the individuals of the lone wolves that were interviewed said that if they thought they were going to hell, they would not have done it. They would not have participated in that act. So they're concerned for their afterlife. So what can we do? We need to understand the messaging, what we are appealing to. Is this the silver bullet? I don't know, but it may give us a glimpse into understanding part of the motivation, part of the drive, part of the need of what is facilitating individuals into violent extremism and radicalization. In the United States, we have, sadly, unfortunately, of late, we've had a lot of school shootings, mass shootings, and they're often individuals, young men, who are alienated and looking for some way of being acknowledged. And that's I'm working on an alternative, another perspective that is communication-based in the sense of acknowledgement, our need, our desire to be acknowledged as existing as human beings. And I think we see this in violent extremism in our schools in the United States and in other capacities where the individual seeks acknowledgement. Not getting it in the positive way, they're going to get it in a negative way. And they're going to be remembered. They're going to achieve immortality. Thank you.
Thank you very much for addressing the issue of motivations by means of discussing two important theoretical perspectives on the matter. Now, you all have the bio of Professor Alex Schmid, but I don't think he needs any introduction whatsoever. What is important is what he is going to add today to his many, many years of reflection and impact on all of us. Thank you, Alex.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Fernando, for the introduction. My presentation will be quite different, perhaps old-fashioned, compared to what we've seen. Radicalization is a problematic paradigm. It was invented as violent radicalization some 14 years ago by some European policymakers who seem to be anxious not to broaden the discussion on root causes of terrorism beyond the potential perpetrators themselves. It has become the dominant focus of research into terrorism, thanks to tens of millions of government funding on both sides of the Atlantic into pathways to extremism and terrorism. Yet for many years, we could do without the concept. When in the 20th century people joined the Communist Party or became fascists or associated with some other problematic ism, we did not call them radicalized. Today, when young people are turning to some militant, non-mainstream ideology, the term is quite indiscriminately used, whether such a political socialization and mobilization to violence takes place in a liberal democracy under a repressive military regime or under a dynastic dictatorship. So radicalization has been used so broadly that it can cover almost everything. In the words of Peter Neumann, radicalization is that which goes on before the bomb goes off. A similar proliferation of terms exists when it comes to de-radicalization. While some see it as a mirror process of radicalizations, others do think that it's not necessarily the reverse of the path to radicalization. So, should de-radicalization be seen as a return from radicalism, as a move back from extremism to moderation, whether religious or secular, or is it sufficient to disengage from violent extremism and adhere to so-called non-violent extremism? Is it merely a de-escalation from violent action to violent hate speech without corresponding harmful physical action? Does it mean rehabilitation and reintegration into society? Is it only an individual process, or is de-radicalization also a group process? These and similar questions make the search for current trends in radicalization and de-radicalization complicated. Another question, admittedly less significant, is where and when should we start when trying to describe current trends of this 14 years old phenomenon? I will try to cover these topics here, and since some of my speakers, the speakers before, have taken less time than the one allocated, I hope the chairman will grant me a bit more. I have 50 pages of text for me, which I'm not going through all of it, but you will at least see the PowerPoint. Yeah. Okay, 10 years ago, I was part of an expert group on violent radicalization chaired by Fernando Reinares. The report that he submitted to the European Commission in May 2008 was never officially released, probably for bureaucratic reasons. But this is a key passage from this report, reflecting the collective wisdom of a dozen experts. It concluded that no single root cause of radicalization leading to terrorism could be identified, since at the intersection of a personal history and the enabling environment, a considerable variety of contributing and facilitating factors can trigger the radicalization process to varying degrees. The Reinares report made 13 recommendations for further research, including one, number 6, calling for more attention towards the nexus between terrorism and counter-terrorism as a potential driver for further and wider radicalization towards violence and terrorism. I took up this idea and published 5 years ago a report on radicalization, de-radicalization, counter-radicalization, which you can download from the internet at ICCT NL. It has been downloaded more than 65,000 times so far. In that paper, I questioned radicalization's exclusive link to radicalism as a political program. I also criticized the focus of most radicalization research on the micro level of the vulnerable individual, pointing to the importance of the radical milieu and developments on the macro level. I also challenged the idea that radicalization is confined to one side only in a conflict diet, as Clark McCauley and Sofia Moskalenko had done before, and I argued that both non-state and state actors can radicalize in the sense of moving closer to the use of violence when engaged in conflict. Based on these and similar considerations, I reconceptualized radicalization as part of a socialization process, often involving indoctrination, and mobilization process, usually involving recruitment by a third party, defining it in the way you see it here on that screen. While my report was downloaded often and cited often in academic papers. It has not been recognized in official circles. Like in the case of terrorism, progress in the field of radicalization studies has been plagued by the fact that there is no commonly accepted definition. If you look at what the European Union uses as definition, again, I'm not reading it, you see it on the wall, it is rather vague conceptualization that has not really developed over the past 14 years. What the European Commission has done is they created a network, RAN, Radicalization Awareness Network, which now has 3,500 participants from academia, civil society, law enforcement, first-line street workers, and so on. And they engage in very useful activities. I just take a sample from what's coming up in the near future. RAN is important, bringing together many people from the European Union, but it's not the only thing that the European response involves. Many of these responses are actually local and municipal, and there are more than 100 different approaches to deal with radicalization. When I asked Juan what are the current trends on radicalization and de-radicalization, I get a rather general answer, which you see here, and which is true as far as it goes, but it doesn't go very far. It doesn't go very deep. So I turned also to a couple of colleagues who had done research in this area, including Clark Macaulay, and asked them for their opinion. But before I give you their wisdom, let me approach it from a different angle. In my report of 2013, I summarized what I thought at that time that we knew about things. I'm not going to discuss these points that are known. Some of them can be contested, certainly the first one, because of the present generation of young people that go into terrorism in European Muslim diasporas. Some of them are clinically perhaps not as normal as point one here points. But by and large, these findings, in my view, still stand. But there were at least 7 areas where I thought we didn't know enough in 2013. And the question is, have we in the past 5 years learned enough so that we can call, this progress and what's going on between the 2 years as a trend? The first question is arguably the toughest of the 7 questions. Why do many share background characteristics of terrorists without becoming terrorists themselves? Holding radical opinions and engaging in extremist violence in the form of terrorism are 2 different things, whereby the first does not necessarily, and in fact seldom, lead to the other. In fact, radicalism and extremism have different genealogies in the history of ideas. Radicalism is a child of the 18th century Enlightenment with its ideas of equality and progress, while extremism is linked to romantic notions of a golden past rooted more in myth than in reason. Most radicals have never made a step from unconventional ideas to political violence. For extremists, on the other hand, the need for violence against an outgroup that is considered threatening or inferior is a given. The bridge between attitudes and behavior has yet to be found. There might be several such bridges. One recent study by a colleague, Bart Schuurman, and a former colleague from St. Andrews, Max Thiele, suggests that fanaticism is the key. The key question they write that many radicalization interpretations cannot address is why most radicals never become terrorists. Fanaticism utility lies in its ability to provide at least the beginning of an answer. Terrorism is still a mode of conflict of a small but fanatical and usually revengeful minority for whom desirable ends justify any means. There are about 370 terrorist organizations in the world, according to START, far fewer than the number of organized crime organizations, of which there are already 5,000 in the European Union alone. But some of these are not small. Al-Qaeda had less than 400 members in 2001, and now it has about 40,000, and other such groups have that too. And if you look at what's the attraction, what are the number of sympathizers, a number of supporters of these groups, I've done a study based on public opinion surveys, which you also can find on the website of the International Center for Counter-Terrorism, ICCT, and I found 7 reasons for sympathy and support. But who does it? Why does one son of a mother become a terrorist and the other son a policeman? These are questions that are difficult to answer, and there are no simple answers. But one study by Analyst of 4 militant groups in Kenya and Uganda that looked at hundreds of families found that it was not the oldest son or the youngest son, but one in the middle that was most likely to become a terrorist. So apparently he had received less attention. I don't want to go into all of these points, but let me just go to the second unanswered question. Why are well-educated, affluent, apparently well-integrated individuals also susceptible to radicalization? Well, here I would like to draw attention to a study by Michele Groppi on radicalization in Italy. It showed that ideology was... Sorry, I went one too far, so how can I get one back? How do I go? It doesn't react. Can I go one back? Oh, that is okay. Okay, that is what Michele Groppi's study, I met him here incidentally, he studied here for a while, found. Just look at the passage that I italicized. The most significant variable was ideology. And that, of course, is not dependent on whether you are upper class or lower class, have much education or little education. In fact, terrorist leaders have quite often, a university education. Often they're dropouts, but still they tried. And socioeconomically also, they tend to be higher up. And that goes even for many that are not on top of the organization. Just going to the next question, who is most vulnerable to radicalization? Well, I just throw your attention at 2 studies that summarizes findings in the United States, respectively, and in Europe. So this is what comes out in a synthesizing report on studies that have been done in the United States. So having a criminal history and having mental health issues come up quite high in the United States, and actually in Europe by the present generation. We are already in the 4th generation of jihadists, starting with the Afghan jihad in the 1980s, and then the Bosnian, and then Iraqi jihad, and now this one. So the findings for different generations differ. So the next question that was unanswered in 2013, but is now roughly answered, is that the role of the internet is indeed very crucial. We could not have had 40,000 people lured to Iraq and Syria without the siren calls of the internet. Then there is another question when it comes to the question whether Islamist radicalization is or is not different from other more secular forms of radicalization. Many authors see more similarities than differences. However, in my opinion, there are significant differences between secular and religious extremism. There is, as we have heard earlier today, the promise of rich rewards beyond the grave in an afterlife that motivates religious terrorists in a way that no secular belief can do. The only thing that they can take to their grave is their honor. Since God will be the only judge of religious terrorists, there is no earthly constituency that can stop them. And fanaticism, zealotry, appears to be more prominent among them. And of course, one particular feature, not exclusively theirs, is suicide terrorism. There have been more than 5,400 suicide terrorist attacks in 40 countries, and the large majority have been conducted by religious terrorists. A student of mine looked at 400 terrorists and the role of conversion among them, and compared a sample of those who converted to Islam to those who were already Muslims, but were sort of born-again Muslims, from lukewarm to fanatical Muslims. And he found many coincidences, overlap between the two types of radicalization. Well, I cannot go through all these things now, but you have been probably influenced, like many of us, by the seminal work of Mark Sageman, Understanding Terrorist Networks, 2004, Leaderless Jihad, 2008, Misunderstanding Terrorism, 2016, and now he has come out with a new work, Turning to Political Violence, the Emergence of Terrorism, and he comes with that formula that summarizes in his views the radicalization process. While I have great admiration for his work, I had some problems with this type of approach. For one thing, turning to political violence is a rather broad field, and terrorism is a narrow type that basically psychological warfare, creating newsworthy events so that the repercussions can influence target audiences. That is much narrower than political violence. And his definition of political violence as the deliberate collective attempt to use force against people or objects for political reason, of course, also applies to what governments do. And his definition of terrorism as a categorization of out-group political violence during domestic peacetime is also open to critique. Well, so this is not the egg of Columbus either. But if we look at what are common things in radicalization in the United States, based again on a summary of existing studies, this list comes up. So belief systems, ideology, and identity processes come up on top of the list. A Dutch researcher has divided the motives, the reasons for engaging in terrorism into political reasons and personal reasons, and come up with this list, which makes sense to me. Now, let me come to trends in radicalization research. These trends are largely determined by funding. After 9/11, 50 billion went into research into biological terrorism, which has never happened on a significant scale so far, on weapons of mass destruction, on use of improvised explosive devices. So these trends are more or less predetermined by those who fund things. I asked Clark Macaulay, who's preparing, together with Sofia Moskalenko, a new version of his book Friction, How Both Sides Radicalize, and he came up with these particular observations that refer to how he sees the trends in radicalization. When it comes to de-radicalization, well, I can also give you a list by another colleague from the University of Hamburg, partly overlapping with that. But when it comes to the other side of de-radicalization, we have some more problems, and that is basically what is interesting us. It has become a major cottage industry with often self-proclaimed experts offering de-radicalization trajectories. While there are few serious players in the field, there are many more false pretenders selling hot air to governments eager to diffuse radicalization processes in their country. Well, there's no doubt that de-radicalization works in some cases, especially for individuals, although the reasons why it works are not always clear, and there is no guarantee that there will be no recidivism after 2 years or so. Voluntary de-radicalization on the group level is really what we should go after, has basically not worked outside a more general peace process, like we see, for instance, in Colombia. And even there, you might always feel splinter groups that find that the government is not giving enough. Or on the other side, you see people coming to government that think they have been sold out. The problem with de-radicalization is it means many things to many people. And so measuring the effectiveness of de-radicalization is difficult because most governments are not willing to lay the data on the table. People who are dismissed as de-radicalized might not really be, but might have made the right movements and prepared the right sentences to come there. So given this definitional pluralism, to use a mild word for chaos, in the field of radicalization and de-radicalization studies and practices, it's hard to give a definite answer to the question, what are the trends? I mean, de-radicalization was a silly term to begin with. You do not go to ask people to change their deeply held beliefs and de-radicalize it. You would think that the term de-radicalization was dead on arrival. But it isn't. It has partly been substituted by countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism. Again, here I pulsed my wise colleague, Clark Macaulay, of what he sees as significant trends. Some of these trends are not so innocent. For instance, more recently, in integrating countering violent extremism with military counterinsurgency doctrine. Well, that might look smart from the side of the military, winning hearts and minds, but it also means that if the military provides hospital services or so, these things are no longer humanitarian gestures that are neutral. And if you look at the attacks on hospitals, ambulances in Afghanistan, and so that might just be a result of the view that Médecins Sans Frontières and others are no longer considered as neutral. I have all the students coming to me and say, I don't know what to write about with the terrorism. Everything has been written up. So in the latest issue of Perspectives on Terrorism, my colleague James Forrest and I came up with a list of 150 research desiderata, and we hope that they will be picked up. It was based not just on our own insights as editors of a journal, but also on those of others. Well, I have talked a little bit about research on radicalization, to a lesser extent about deradicalization, but what happens on the ground when it comes to Islamist radicalization and de-radicalization, which I defined here some 8 years ago in these terms. Well, at the moment, the world's largest de-radicalization effort is going on in China against real and potential militants among the 10 million Uyghurs living in Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The Communist Party has, since 1949, when East Turkestan ceased to exist as a country, brought in millions of Han Chinese. There was 6% Han in East Turkestan in 1949. Now they're 58%. So this invasion of non-Muslims contributed to Uyghur nationalism and separatism. There were race riots in 2009 and a wave of repression. A small minority, very small, of East Turkestan Islamic movement and Turkestan Islamic Party militants turned to terrorism. And the response of the Chinese authorities has been extraordinary. They introduced mass surveillance. There are more than 170 million cameras hanging in whole of China, with many of them in East Turkestan. Video cameras in public places linked with video analytic hubs, intelligence monitoring systems, big data centers backed up by police checkpoints. Many Uyghurs have gone abroad and fought in Afghanistan, and probably up to 5,000 in Syria. While de-radicalization in the West, except in the prison context perhaps, is mostly voluntary, the opposite is true in China, where up to 1 million people, estimates go even beyond 1 million, have been sent to the Radicalization Center. 1 million Uyghurs out of 10 million, that means every 5th adult. And if you take the children and the old people away, it means that in some places, not just 10%, but up to 40% of the population have been sent to these centers for wearing a long beard or for having a son that studies abroad. And the threat of being sent to these centers can already be severe. I remember the story of a boy of 10 years old who was told, if you don't know the text of the Communist Party manifesto or some similar text by tomorrow, you will be sent to one of these centers, where he committed suicide rather than face that prospect. In these centers, all sort of things going on. They have to renounce Islam, criticize their own belief, and those of fellow inmates recite Communist Party propaganda songs for hours each day, eat pork and alcohol. There have also been reports of torture and extrajudicial executions. And the way the Chinese authorities approach it, and this is a transcript from an official Communist Party audio recording, is that it is a form of mental illness. If you read these texts and look at the practices, it reminds me really back of the Cultural Revolution of the 1970s. And this practice, if that is a harbinger of China's expansion over the world, is certainly something that is a source of great concern for human rights activists. Well, does it work, such an approach? Yes, I think it works. It worked like the approach worked in Argentina, where in the 1970s, 30,000 Argentinians were picked up, even if your name, if you were a dentist and your name was in the agenda of a militant, you had also a chance to be picked up. But that is an approach that we in the West would not like to go down. I asked a leading person from Iran, a German politician who has good grasp of the Arab world as well as of counter-terrorism measures, where he sees the trend in terms of radicalization, de-radicalization, and his take on where we are going with the UN and the EU could not be more different than what the Chinese approach is. So, where should we go? I think we should not just study radicalization, radicalism, extremism, and terrorism. We should also study what moderation in politics is. I was asked to speak for the global movement of moderates at the UN last year. And in preparing myself, I was amazed how little literature there was on moderation. The only significant thing I came across was from a Romanian political scientist at the Indiana University, Aurelian Cariutu, who studied the history of ideas of moderation since the 18th century, produced some articles and books, and he came up with 10 well, I summarized from his work 10 tenets of a moderate style in politics. And if you remember that Jean Boudin in the 18th, 17th century created the term politics, the way we use it, as an alternative to the ideological Reformation, counter-revolution, Protestants, Huguenots, Catholics fight. Basically, we had drawn in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 a line and went to a more enlightened form of politics that was characterized by give and take and moderation. And this is basically also what comes out of the work of Aurelian. And I think this flexibility is something we have to find at all sides. And moderation is not something of the political center. You can be a moderate whether you're on the right or on the left. The only thing you cannot do as a moderate, that is to be tolerant against the intolerant, because they will use a salami technique and take more and more of your freedoms away. So I urge you not to study radicalization alone, but also study moderation. In my lecture in New York, I had this as a takeaway thought, which I also give you, because I have not come up with a better thought since October last year. But sorry if I have taken too much of your time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Alex, for revisiting so critically your fundamental 2013 document and adding further value and insight to it. Now, the last presentation is a joint presentation by Professor Steinberg and Ms. Deutsch. Professor Steinberg teaches political science at Bar-Ilan University here in Israel, but they are both members of NGO Monitor. He's the president, actually, and Ms. Olga Deutsch is the director of the European desk, if I'm correct. Following their presentation, all the speakers will be so kind as to come to the table, and then we'll have some at least some half an hour time for questions and answers. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, especially for me in this distinguished assembly. I am modestly the only non-professor on the panel, so I am really humbled to be here. As mentioned in the introduction, Professor Steinberg is the founder and the president of NGO Monitor. I head our Europe operations. NGO Monitor is an independent research institute. We focus on looking at the activities of the human rights and humanitarian non-governmental organizations who in one way or another are active within the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We are based in Jerusalem. We take a critical look at their activities around the world. We are talking about all non-governmental organizations, from smaller, mid-sized or bigger Israeli or Palestinian organizations, all the way to NGOs in Germany that very few may have heard of, such as Kurve Wustro, and all the way to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc. Any organization that is active within this context. We have a very, very large database of organizations that we monitor, and interestingly we also cross-reference their activities and put them in a broader context of development aid, meaning that governments, mainly EU and European governments, but not only, engage with the civil society, fund them and give them platform in the context of development aid. Much has been said on this panel alone on the process of radicalization. I will try not to be repetitive, especially in presence of such authorities on the subject. I think one common denominator probably on every conference on counter-terror is the fact that there is no uniform definition of what terror is. Professor Boaz Ganor opened this conference on Monday evening with another cry that there should be a definition. But there is a consensus that we need to analyze the process of radicalization in all our attempts to understand how one or an individual or a group is brought to a moment where he or a group takes to weapons and conducts a terror attack. As already mentioned by Professor Schmid, there should be, though, a clear separation of terminology. Terms like radicalism, extremism, radicalization, and I may add activism are very often conflated and mixed in the literature. I may quote Professor Schmid, where he says that radicalism is a sweeping political change based on a conviction that the status quo is unacceptable. Now, in literature, we see difference between non-violent and what is perceived as democratic radicalism, and then a difference between that and what is seen as violent and usually non-democratic activities. Now, we need to put against that what is seen as violent extremism, which is always non-democratic and is not flexible and is always condemned. Now, we would like to add to that perspective activism, which is very often conflated with radicalism. Important to know, radical is a very flexible term. What is radical in one society is not going to be seen as radical in another. Women driving cars in certain countries is seen as a very radical idea. In our society, it is not. But not everything that is radical is always to be seen as extremist. In all literature, I want to fast forward through the theoretic part because so much has been said about it already. In all literature that we have seen, different agents or potential agents that contribute to the process of radicalization are always seen with a dual possibilities. They can both serve as agents of the process of radicalization as well as the agents of the process of de-radicalization. Let's take religious communities. A religious community, a mosque or a church, can both be a place where young people are radicalized and attracted to violence, but it can also play a pivotal role in exactly the opposite process, because it can counter them, it can, through education, etc. If a government, for example, is an oppressive regime, they can be a main factor of the process of radicalization. On the other hand, if the government takes a lead in de-radicalization processes, it can be an agent of de-radicalization. And so on for literally every potential agent out there, except for the civil society. Professor Schmid has mentioned RUN, the Radicalization Awareness Network in Europe, and they summarize it quite well. The civil society is seen as one of the most important agents of the process of de-radicalization, of counter-radicalization. They do identify, for example, that certain groups out there, like environmental activists or animal rights activists, can be extremist, but civil society frameworks are almost solely and always seen as one of the main vehicles of countering radicalization. We wish to introduce a critical view at the potential role that civil society can and does play in the context of the radicalization, in order to be able to understand what potential role can it play in the process of de-radicalization and how we should engage with the civil society in order to achieve that. We will be presenting 3 case studies today to you. First one being Spain, where we will focus on how local narratives that we see are being picked up by the civil society groups are, on one hand, internationalized, and on the other hand, are given even more of a platform in the context of the international development aid. The second case study will focus on Germany, where we will look at a different phenomenon, which is the disconnect between the policy makers and the ones who actually are on the ground implementers of the policy in the context of the development aid. And the third case study will be the double facade, meaning how we see examples on the ground of civil society and non-governmental organizations taking up different messages dependent on the audience. I just want to make a disclaimer. We do focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict related or active organizations. Having said that, we see that the phenomenon and the challenges that we recognize in our field of expertise are same across the policy, across the region, and across the conflicts, because this is development aid is relevant usually in the context of the conflict-ridden areas. I would like to move to the examples, because that's where we demonstrate our theory, and Ms. Professor Steinberg will look into the Spanish case study.
Just click the button here. Does that work? Yes. As Olga said, NGO Monitor, the work that we've been doing, and I've been doing it now for 16 or 17 years, and some of you we've met at previous sessions, as we've been developing further our database. And we also include the main Western European, not just Western European, but primarily Western European countries that are among the main funders, the main supporters of the civil society network that we look at, these types of organizations. A lot of the money that goes to them comes from governmental frameworks, which in most cases don't have the resources, they don't have the interest, they don't have the concept or the intelligence capabilities to focus on the actual nature of what the organizations do. And that's what we try to look at, and particularly in this area of radicalization, connections to terrorist organizations. So what I'm going to show you is one of the cases. Olga will do the other ones, but we could probably do something similar, and we are doing something similar in looking at other countries that also generally provide funding for organizations under the headline of, or the framework of human rights, international development, democracy development, and similar terms, where the organizations that receive the money, if you go do a little bit of due diligence, one sees that in fact they are very much agents of radicalization, and the damages that take place as a result of that are increased significantly by the support, not just in terms of the financial support that they get, but also in terms of the authorization. If you're funded by a government, if you're funded by a Western European government, if you're funded by the European Union, if you're funded by some other framework like that, it gives legitimacy, and of course it gives you operational capabilities. Just as one example, many of the organizations we're going to talk about, and we'll give you examples, are able to access, to speak in, to go into the European Parliament in Brussels, or to Geneva, to the United Nations Human Rights Council. They have that status and capability, and part of it is because they are supported by, not just financially, but often, I would say, politically and bureaucratically, by the governments that are involved in this process. So, as Olga said, I'm going to start with the Spanish example and just present some specific examples of that. In Spain, it's an interesting phenomenon. In Spain, a lot of the funding that goes for these types of organizations actually comes from the regions. Some of it comes from the central government, but some comes from the regions. And you see a very close relationship between the ideologies, the politics of the region, particularly in terms of separatist movements, independence movements, themselves can be described often as being radical groups. The first example is from a Basque politician, Catalonia, convicted ETA member, and talks about the need for internationalism, that discover that struggles need to become more global, and as a result, what they do is they find partners. They cultivate, they collaborate with, and they find partners, including very often in our conflict here. So you see a lot of the cooperation that takes place, including the funding in these frameworks. So here's an example of a Basque pro-independence party, which in 2015 called for the immediate release of a Palestinian by the name of Khalida Jarrar, who is also very active. She's the vice president of Adamir, which is an organization, which is an NGO. It is classified by the United Nations and European Union as a human rights NGO that offers legal aid to political prisoners. They are the leading organization among Palestinians campaigning for the release of what they call political prisoners, what the Israeli legal system, justice system calls terrorists in Israeli jails. Also happens to be a senior official, and I say happens in quotation marks, of an ironic tone if that didn't come across, of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is recognized, it's a designated terror organization in the US, Canada, European Union, and other countries. So you see this dual hat, and that's not at all unusual. We have many, many cases of NGOs with that recognition of being human rights organizations or international aid organizations, where many of the officials, the founders, the leaders of that organization are also simultaneously members of a terrorist group. And this is an organization which is supported strongly by, in Catalonia, by political processes and members of government, and they receive public funds in the process.
Absolutely not.
Sorry?
Absolutely not.
Okay, if we're wrong, we're happy to.
Absolutely not.
We have partners that we work with closely in Spain, and this is a
Absolutely
joint process.
You're wrong.
Well, here we have an example, for instance, that the Basque Agency for Development Cooperation provided close to 200,000 euros. It's interesting, they're €2 short of 200,000 to Adamir. That's a significant amount of money for this organization, provides them with a lot of resources and capabilities. They also partner with the Basque NGO called So de Paz. I'll certainly accept any corrections in the pronunciation, which they receive from the autonomous community of Navarra. Oh, this is even more money, so together we're up to over €500,000 in this period. Now, what does Adamir do? And again, I'm taking one example. We could easily do 10 examples. We don't quite have the time to do that. But just to develop just to show you how the process works. So an organization that is linked to Adamir, an organization which is primarily supported from the Catalonia region in Spain, co-organized an event in the European Parliament in 2017. This is a form of the legitimizing of a terrorist process by giving them the framework of supporting Western democratic values. And the director of Ademir and Khalida Jarrar's lawyer came, Sahar Francis, Leila Khaled, who was a leader of the PFLP, who led a series of airplane hijackings in the 1970s, and a woman by the name of Ahmed Tamimi spoke at this event in the European Parliament. Now, these are all people who have direct connections to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. They don't show up under the PFLP flag and as terrorist organization. They come as a a Palestinian human rights organization. And again, certainly it was enabled by the funding that they got from the Spanish regional framework. And the quotes, I'm not going to go through the quotes, I'll leave them on here just to give you, we're talking about radicalization, so to give you the type of language that's used in the context of the Palestinian struggle, you could say, the Palestinian ongoing conflict with Israel. The language speaks for itself. Zionist forces, the martyrs, people who terrorists who attempt to kill on the day that she spoke, an Israeli and was shot in the process, is immediately called a martyr. And this language continues to echo throughout the process. The concept of repackaging activism, it's called activism, but you can see the radicalization of in the language that's used. Here's a poster that was advertised. Again, we've talked a lot about having online capabilities, social media capabilities, and you can follow the activities of these organizations by looking at the online advertising. Hosted these people in 2017 in Madrid under the framework of a nonviolent resistance and boycott of Israel, BDS process for human rights. So you see the linking of the two terms here. Again, they were talking still about a framework which is linked to the PFLP. Then another group, Novak, hosted them in Barcelona, and you see the language here, funded by, and that's interesting, this is an event, a conference, in which you have members of this quasi-terror, quasi-NGO human rights organization appearing, funded jointly by the European Union, the Catalan Agency for Development Cooperation, the Municipality of Barcelona. And other speakers that were there were UN officials and the Catalan Minister of Foreign Affairs and other members of the framework. Now, Manal Tamimi, do we have some of the, I'm not sure we left in the, yeah, here's some of the Twitter posts that she has. She is a member of the framework of what's called the Women's Center of a Palestinian NGO with very good sounding human rights language, the Women's Center for Legal Aid and Counseling, which is fundamentally supported and funded by European governments. She was nominated in 2017. She was coined. The language was used that she was a UN human rights defender. That language was taken out after we sent some of the details, this particular set of information. And you would say to yourself, well, a European government, which is in itself, all the European governments are under the threat of terrorism, that have adopted in various ways the International Holocaust Remembrance Association definition of anti-Semitism. You don't need to have the IRA definition to be able to identify these Twitter posts. Why would you why would you provide a platform for these kind of people? Now, we can talk later on about the question of due diligence. Do they do the due diligence? Do they do it knowingly? Do they say yes, but there are overriding concerns? In many of the cases that we've looked at, although there's this sort of concept of European intersectionality in the sense of radical groups fighting in their own battles, then link up with other ones, as we saw in the case of Catalonia and elsewhere, but it's something that it needs to be addressed in a more serious manner. I'm just going to go back to, this is one of the people who was in that conference, so I wanted to illustrate that. Well, sorry, we'll go further a little bit quickly. Okay, here's another example. I won't go into the details here, but the language that's used is pretty straightforward. We want to tell the world that Palestinians deal with organized terror. We will continue to cope in order to struggle against Nazi occupation. This is the head of the Palestinian, what's it called, PSC, Struggle Coordinating Committee. There are other examples we could give you. I just wanted to give you a taste of the case from Spain, and Olga will now take over for giving the German case.
I wanted to deliberately leave part of what originally were my introduction remarks for between the different two case studies, because after you have had a little bit of a taste of the examples, they will make more sense. When we speak about the radicalization, we almost always, or at least usually, try to understand how one takes up guns at the end of the process of the radicalization, how one or a group ends up committing a terror attack. What we are trying to show, and what our research in the past 15 years has clearly shown, is that the process of radicalization only has terror as only one of the results of that process. And what we see in the context of the development aid happening and in engagement with the civil society is that the boundaries of the discourse are being shifted. We see that we focus on the end means. We focus on how one ends up taking up the guns, as opposed to the ideas, or as Professor Ronald said, the worldviews that an individual or a group endorses, adopts, and then spreads through their partnerships and groups and civic engagement, civic activity. I want to go into the German example that will be very illustrative because it will focus on the other end of this equation. The Spanish examples were more about how the NGOs, through their partnerships, multiply and take extremist, rejectionist, discriminatory ideas, ideologies, and messages, and are granted a platform that gives them legitimacy, thus shifting the boundaries of the discourse. They change the rules of the games of what is allowed to say in a public discourse, or what is allowed to say in a civic. Gerald always says that we call it a civil society where the discourse is not usually civil. In the German case study, we want to show the disconnect between the government in Berlin that defines the policy across the board, and then what actually happens on the ground. A very, very illustrative example are the activities of Stiftungen. Those are the political foundations in Germany, each of them affiliated with one of the political parties. They are funded by the Federal Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Ministry of Development and Cooperation, and their funding is allocated from the budget directly in accordance to the results at the previous elections. So meaning dependent on how well the party that the political foundation is affiliated with did well in the last elections. They have been there for more than 60 years, and they serve three main objectives: education, on democratic participation, academic achievements, and democratic practices in foreign countries. Now, their importance has been recognized even since the 60s. However, in the recent years, we see that their budgets clearly show where the focus of their activities lies. More than half of the budget of the political foundations in Germany is allocated for their activities in the development projects, meaning abroad, outside of Germany. Okay. Let's take a look at the Heinrich Böll Stiftung, the Heinrich Böll political foundation that is affiliated with with Germany's Green Party. In 2017, Heinrich Böll Stiftung's Ramallah office co-sponsored an event called 1987 Intifada History and Memory, featuring speakers that are former and current members of Hamas and PFLP. They featured Hassan Yusuf, who was introduced there as a Hamas movement leader in the West Bank, and Yunis Al-Jarro, who is a former leader of PFLP. Let me remind everyone in the audience, if it's not if it wasn't clear, that Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine is a terrorist organization. It's designated as such by the EU, US, Canada, and Israel. After there was a major social media and media outrage surrounding this, Heinrich Böll Stiftung removed its support to the event. But the initial reaction of the Heinrich Böll Stiftung Tel Aviv office was, this cannot be. This is just, it's a lie, and this is disinformation, etc. But after some due diligence inside of the Stiftung, they removed their support from the event. Now, officially, the Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Berlin clearly supports a two-state solution, a dialogue between the two people, etc. So it shows the disconnect between the offices in Berlin that draw the policies and what happens on the ground, as well as shows the, let's call it the escalation of the, we like to call it the conceptual climate in which, or as you called it, the cultural worldview in which each of the offices exists and functions, because the Tel Aviv office was outraged at what happened, whereas it was the Ramallah Political Foundation's office that was co-hosting the event. Let's take a look at the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is the political foundation linked to the Germans' Social Democratic Party. In 2015, their Ramallah office funded a publication that was authored by the Dr. Mahdi Abdul Hadi, who is the founder and director of PASIA, the Palestinian Academic Society for the Study of International Affairs. Allow me to quote just a few of the lines from the publication. The publication describes a wave of stabbing attacks and shootings that began in October 2015 here in Israel as youth uprising that exhibited survival and resistance with self-confidence, courage, and accepting the consequences of their actions against Israelis with a smile. It also refers to Palestinian martyr Bahan Elian as one of two terrorists, who was one of the two terrorists to board a bus in Jerusalem in October, murdering 3 and injuring 7 as a martyr, Shahad. You were also showing the movies that basically glorify martyrdom. And when you see, there's a difference between, there's an escalation, a clear escalation between a movie that recruits, and then when you see it in an academic paper that is also funded by a German political foundation with all the stamina that comes with that, then it becomes part of that worldview, all the conceptual climate, and it also becomes a legitimate discourse. It enters, it penetrates the political discourse. The same political foundation's Ramallah office also cooperates with the previously mentioned Women's Affairs Technical Committee. WATEC inaugurated earlier in 2017 a building and named it after the terrorist Dalal Mughrabi, who carried out the Coastal Road Massacre in '78, murdering 37 civilians, including 12 children. When international donors who fund this organization found out about this, many of them exhibited outrage, and Norway pulled out their funding immediately, and several other governments declared they distanced themselves from it. But the foundation from Berlin did not do that. They remained they stayed faithful to their support to the organization. It's interesting to know that the same organization is also funded by, because again, why am I mentioning this? In no way do we try to isolate Spain or Germany here as special. There are only but 2 case studies. The same organization is funded by EU, Diaconia, the Secretariat, which used to be a consortium of 5 governmental funders, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, Norway, and Netherlands. The Norwegian Church Aid, Open Society Foundation, etc. So it becomes part of a broader club where if a German government or German foundation funds something, that grants them legitimacy and makes it easier to harbor support from others as well. The same foundation also cooperates, this is an interesting example in particularly, with the PNGO. PNGO is a Palestinian NGO network of 35 NGOs, including WATEC, the previous organization that inaugurated the building. They enjoy generous funding, amongst others, from the European Union. But more interestingly, and this is because it goes way beyond the funding. The funding is yet one aspect of why is this a problematic issue. They were EU basically commissioned PNGO to draft in 2008 a Palestinian NGO code of conduct. To show how holistic the challenge actually is. Now, PNGO is a leader of anti-normalization, and it forbids all its members to engage in any type of normalization with the, as they call it, occupier, be it in the cultural sphere, educational, or any other, so not only in political. In 2013, PNGO condemned EU peace-building initiatives, and when one of its members was to be granted a grant from USAID, one of the standard procedures of USAID grants is to sign an anti-terror clause, and PNGO basically said you cannot sign an anti-terror clause. When the same center, named after Dar al-Mughrabi, was inaugurated, and all these European governments and the UN were outraged, PNGO called it conditional funding and condemned Norway for pulling out its funds from the center. Another example, Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung is a German political foundation linked to the Die Linke, the left party in Germany. And again, as Gerald said, we have many, many examples, but we just assembled some of the more disturbing ones. In an interview published by the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung with their liaison lecturer, Helga Baumgarten, they published the following quote from her. Describing the 2015 Palestinian terror wave, she said, it was an isolated Palestinian teenagers, almost children, who in individual actions as a result of their desperation over their personal circumstances resorted to resistance in the form of stabbing attacks against Israeli soldiers and settlers. Down the slide, you can see that basically she goes on to develop the idea and say that there can be only one solution, one state in historical Palestine. And moving onward to their Rosa Luxemburg's Tel Aviv or Israel office, Tzafrir Cohen, the head of their Israel office, in 2017 stated that processes of colonization usually end through resistance of the colonized against the colonizers. We are not seeing this now, he said. The Palestinians are tired after 2 uprisings. Now, it is interesting to also pay attention to the terminology that is used. It starts with resistance, with non-violent initiatives. It goes to youth uprisings, and it always escalates to one state and no other resolution. All means are justified in fighting a Nazi occupation, etc., etc. And somewhere there, they just simply erase all red lines of, again, let me quote Professor Steinberg, of what should be a civil discourse, and referring to the moderation that Professor Schmid called for. Moving back to Germany, okay? German International Cooperation Agency, GIZ. It is basically a consulting agency owned by the government, funded by the government, commissioned by the government to implement its development projects abroad. They operate around the world. They have more than 100 offices and presence in many, many countries, in the region alone, in Jordan, in Egypt, in West Bank, etc. Earlier this year, this was published in the media, both here in Israel and in Germany. There were a series of employees of theirs who became a little bit too active politically in their social media. So here's, for example, a head of their program in Jordan who commented on his Facebook referring to Hamas rocket attacks. Everyone, dictatorial or not, living under such conditions has the right to resist. Also, there is no right of self-defense of the occupier against the occupied. Another employee of theirs, it's a former project manager in Jordan who later moved to work for their headquarters in Germany, in 2014 addressed Israel in Arabic. May the curse of Allah be upon you. Your days are numbered. And I guess the images speak for themselves. I do not have to elaborate on that. Moving away from any particular country and taking a more of a zoom out onto the phenomenon, what our research shows is that there is also, we call it a double facade. There is an ability and a tendency of groups that exhibit, that we see that have propagate for rejection, is discriminatory narratives, to change messages and adapt them according to the audiences. So if they speak at home and in Arabic, on their website in Arabic, the messages will have one format. But if they go to the European Parliament or they address the potential donor governments, then their messaging will be quite different. We see also that it goes across areas. For example, cultural Palestinian organizations that are supposed to promote cultural projects, cultural festivals, etc. We see that they have they tend to propagate politicized messages as well. In 2017, a Palestinian Popular Arts Center that was funded also by the EU co-organized a children's festival. And one dance routine was titled Songs of the Intifada, another one, Brother, Point the Gun. Moving to women organizations, Palestinian organizations that are supposed to deal with gender equality or inequality within the Palestinian society, and they are supposed to promote, empower women, are also politicized and pushed into this anti-normalization narrative. You see one of the posters here of an of one of such women organizations. The text in Arabic says, "I love the revolution. All the beautiful girls who join will be the noblest." And she's holding a rifle. And when speaking about Spain, Gerald elaborated in length about Adamir, who, again, sectorially took the issue of prisoners and the prisoner rights and then uses it as a vehicle to propagate rejection, discriminatory, sometimes anti-Semitic messages, and then messages that are always extremist because they glorify terror and martyrdom. To conclude, the process of deradicalization and the foreign development aid are both very controversial in literature and in practice, and they sort of both offer a blind spot because we don't always see the full picture, and we don't always take into account every factor and every agent that might play a role. Donors and policy makers, they often also either lose sight or not know what their support, either through funding or through granting a platform and legitimacy, are doing on the ground. It is important to know that the process of radicalization in the context of development aid and civil engagement with the civil society is a dynamic process, and it does not happen in a vacuum. And if we may, in a very modest way, because we are not trying to offer solutions for how to counter-radicalize, rather we are trying to say that when understanding the process of radicalization, civil society should also be critically taken into consideration. One of the first steps that we would recommend is demystification of the role of civil society, because unless we understand that too can be an agent of the process of radicalization, that we will continue failing in engaging with it in a proper way when trying to counter radicalization. We do believe that there should be red lines when it comes to our engagement with civil society, and they seem straightforward, but as evidence show, do not promote anti-Semitism, do not glorify martyrdom and terror, do not incite to violence. Those should be the red lines, but lack of due diligence and lack of critical view at the civil society show that these things still happen on the ground, and clearly they thrive in the era of populism, where and Professor Schmid explained this, that radicalization is a reactionary process. When one end of the discourse goes radical, the other one responds to it, ultimately not allowing anything in the middle to be granted a voice, rather only further polarizing the discourse, and thus enabling each one's political echo chamber. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So please, the speakers might now come to the table and perhaps take some questions from the audience.
Can you click the next slide, just put it on while people are coming up? Just hit the button one more time. Just push the mouse.
No, just the next.
Okay, whatever.
Just disconnected.
We left one more slide we wanted to show you. This is this is from a Swedish government publication, from an organization, agency with a budget of well over 100 million euros a year, that doesn't exactly like the kind of research that we do on these issues. This is from earlier this week.
To allow them more room.
And one of the reasons is because, as a result of the research we did on Sweden, a number of the organizations that they funded were defunded because of their links with extremism and radicalization. I'm going to excuse myself in about 5 minutes. I apologize. I'm going to head back to Jerusalem. So, Olga, you'll take over and you'll answer all the questions.
So you are all invited to take the floor with questions, comments, observations to individually or collectively speakers in this workshop. Jacob?
I'll ask one question. Just to start off, I'll speak even louder. I'm asking one question, okay, there you go. Now y'all can see me. So, I'm trying to reconcile something between the Schmid and Steinberg-Deutsch presentation, because Schmid said, focused on moderates, and you gave a list of 7 things that moderates do. But your talk was basically saying extremists can easily fake being moderate. And so if the standard is going to be let's try to focus on moderates, then by your presentation it'll just be very easy for extremists to pretend to be moderates, probably not jihadists. So I mean, is there going to be some contradiction there? Or am I missing something? Like it won't give the solution to counter-extremism or radicalization if you focus on moderates, because it's so easy to meet those 7 standards of moderation for extremists. Because you said they're just extremists by night and then moderates by day because they change their discourse. So.
I'm not sure whether I understood your question, but of course there is something called double talk in politics, and indoor and outdoor. But I just brought in the idea of moderation because we tend to look at radicalization as something going away from the normal. And what is normal changes also in society. And the fact that we concentrate so much on extremism without saying what is the opposite, what is the normal, makes us lose sight of what politics in normal times are. You see this polarization now in the United States in extreme form between two political parties that all claim to have a long democratic tradition. The Republicans have an emancipatory role when it comes to black emancipation, and it has moved away from that. So we constantly have to research the center of society and look for dialogue. The problem is it takes two to tango, and if one side is unwilling to make that move, then there's only so much you can do with moderation. Would you like to add your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I actually don't see any contradiction between what Professor Schmid was talking and what we were showing, and I will explain why. There are several aspects that should be taken into consideration. Number one, the donor governments, let's start there. And that's the easier part, because that's where the political discourse is, that's where the decision making is, and that's where the overarching willingness to be moderate should be. The donor governments don't always know what is going on the ground, or more often than not, okay? Now, sometimes, yes, you see a situation where the decision makers and definitely officials are politicized, so they take sides in a conflict-ridden area where they try to engage with the civil society, but more often than not, the decision makers do not know. That has to do with the romanticization of the way we engage with the civil society. And that's exactly what we are trying to say, that we should try to critically look at this engagement with civil society as well. We look critically at every other potential agent of the process of radicalization, but we do not do that when it comes to the civil society. Further on, the donor governments have a policy where they fund projects and not organizations. When we try to engage with any one donor government, this is a standard answer in the EU and in the EU member states. We do not fund project. We do not fund the entire organization. We give funds for this specific project, basically taking away the responsibility for anything that that same organization might do outside of that particular project, which is a problem because we need to look at the activities of any one organization holistically. Just like I cannot speak on this panel and say something, but then tomorrow go on a different conference and speak differently, and then I do not take responsibility for what I said yesterday. The issue is how we engage with the civil society and how we choose which NGOs we partner with and which NGOs can promote. And that is where the moderation definitely plays a role, because we need to, on one hand, make sure that the civil discourse is within the boundaries of A, what is legal, and B, what is civil and moderate. And on the other end, this is probably a much bigger challenge. In order to try to counter radicalization or these kind of things, the examples that we were showing, we should probably try in our attempts to engage with the civil society to bring conflicting narratives together and to confront them. Now, this is easier said than done, clearly, but I think that might be a direction, because that way we might try to challenge the ones who propagate for discriminatory, rejectionist, and extremist messages within each echo chamber, within each group. I hope that answers.
Your definition on Islamist radicalization includes the use of violence, like the adoption of the jihad as an armed struggle. So I was wondering in which category would non-violent Islamist groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, Biobehavioral, and so on fall? And how would you assess the relationship between non-violent Islamist organizations or non-violent Islamism and violent Islamism?
Can I also take your question, please?
Sure. I guess you can answer whichever part, anyone that wants to take it, because it's sort of twofold. One of the slides in your presentation dealt with the problem of measuring the effectiveness of deradicalization programs or CDE programs. So trying to measure whether they actually work or not. And I know that there's quite a bit of literature on new approaches to de-radicalization or to countering violent extremism when it's so tough to find actual measures of whether the programs that we actually have and the initiatives that we have actually work. And I wonder if there's more utility in sort of spending more energy on wrestling with that to determine if maybe we have something that's worthwhile that we should maybe complement or expand. And then the other part of that is, listening to all of you talk, it made me wonder whether there's more utility in chasing the generalizable understanding of the radicalization process, or if we should spend more time on sort of contextual social and political radicalization processes that are sort of endemic to specific cases, specific countries, or something like that, because the context seems so different that it may not even be generalized.
So the third question in this same series, please. Good to know.
To Professor Rogan, thanks for the brilliant insights. I'm interested in the role of organizations in the quest for significance, because I'm looking at the group level, and I was interested because radicalization very often is sport for organizations, so they provide the means and the lures for the individuals. And so do you think that the quest for significance also holds for the organizations themselves? Because they mobilize more resources in order to obtain legitimacy, for example?
Perhaps we can start from left to right.
One of the questions was about how about non-violent extreme movements like the Muslim Brotherhood. I think there's a misunderstanding between non-violent and not violent. There is a philosophy of non-violence of Martin Luther King or Gandhi that is principled and that seeks the moral high ground in a conflict. Even when the other side uses violence, you do not. And you hope that this stance will be persuasive. If you look at the history of the Muslim Brotherhood, it has engaged in assassination, it has engaged in terrorism, it has pragmatically sometimes withdrawn its militant, violent action, and in other cases it has brought it out. So that is non-principled, purely tactical or strategic non-violence. And if you look at movements like Al-Mujahirun in England, they are the ones that have basically radicalized people and made them go to Afghanistan or to Syria. So there's a division of labor between those who preach action but are themselves not violent and those who are persuaded by them and go them. So much for the first question. About the other question on how to measure the effectiveness of de-radicalization. Well, there are various instruments. VERA, for instance, is one that developed in Canada. I developed another one. There are several of these around. But these are basically questionnaires which you can use to assess the writings, the speeches, the actions of people out of prison, or you use in prison to see how far they are on de-radicalization projects. And human beings can fool others, they can fool themselves, they can lie. So these instruments are all of questionable effectiveness. It's like measuring prevention. If something doesn't happen, was that the result of a successful preventive strategy? Oh, because the other side had not even considered to do it. So it remains a constant dilemma on how to approach this.
Professor Rogan?
Thank you. I'll try to my best to answer your question in discerning what you are asking. Individuals make up the group and the organization. And so for the individual, I've been talking about it from an individualistic perspective, the individual need to address the need for significance and our quest for immortality. Becoming a member of the group then, being a member of the group, individuals making up the group, then our identity becomes associated with the group. And so making up the group as individuals and then with leaders and members of the group, their identity is therefore reinforced and their significance is reinforced. So in essence, yes, the group as an entity strives for significance. Immortality, they don't seek to destroy themselves in the end, but ideally to be living in perpetuity as an entity. We see very few groups, particularly political bureaucracies or government agencies, that you rarely hear the group say, yeah, we've done our job, we're going to go away now, we're done. So end our funding, end our bureaucracy, we're finished. And I think the same thing would hold true for groups. They become self-perpetuating in that the identity of the individual is linked to the group and becomes the source of significance for the individual and therefore by the group. And I just want to, in your comment about assessing for a second, where should we be focusing our attention in assessing? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, take a stance in saying that independent of the socio-political context, what I've been talking about and trying to propose is that there are basic human motives and needs in our need and our desire for significance as individuals, to be acknowledged, to be recognized, to feel worth, that we exist as human beings. Think about being ignored. Some of our most heinous forms of punishment include solitary confinement, not being acknowledged, not being recognized, not being significant to others. The process of being shunned, right, as a significant form of punishment within particular social groups. So this need to be acknowledged, to be recognized, to be affirmed, to have significance, and that our life has meaning, these are needs that I would argue, these are motives that are pan-cultural, they're universal, independent of the socio-political context. Now, those needs and that salience of those needs are then, when that becomes salient for the individual, then links on to a particular ideology. And that's when we see it going into violence, to extremism, and radicalization. And that's also what we need to study. So I'm proposing looking at the messages and trying to understand what those basic needs are and thinking about how we address those needs for the individual.
Any further comments? Please.
My name is... Oh, sorry. Yeah. My question is for sort of Teresa. In regards to the radicalization process of Muslims that you mentioned in your presentation, Portugal has not a very large Muslim community. Is there any radicalization example that we have in the country? And if not, is that something that the country is worried about? And if so, what would be the solution or good action?
My question is to Professor London. Functional underlying model, very interesting conceptually. Has it been tried in any other form of therapeutic modalities? If your background is addiction, has it been done in addiction or anyone else? Are there any outcome measures?
All right. Teresa?
Well, in Portugal, we don't have an example of radicalization within our borders. There have been some Portuguese that were recruited by the Daesh, but they were not in Portugal. No, sorry. There were just one case from Portugal. The other ones were Portuguese, but were recruited in London or somewhere else in the United Kingdom. The Muslim community in Portugal is smaller compared with the other countries. The Muslims in Portugal came from the former Portuguese colonies, from Mozambique and from Guinea-Bissau. And we can say they are moderate. And as far as I know, we don't have so much problems that other European countries have.
Is that a worry that the country is considering?
Yes, of course, because of the return of the foreign fighters that went to Syria and to Iraq, and then they are returning to Portugal, to Spain, to United Kingdom. That is the worry of the Portuguese authorities. Thank you.
Professor Randall?
So this question has to do with the use of the fMRI model to evaluate brain function and change in systems outside of radicalization. And yes, fMRI has certainly been used as a metric of, number one, brain dysfunction in a variety of disorders, particularly addiction. And in the addiction field, one of the key findings over the past decade, which has come from fMRI, is in fact a dysfunction of the control of reward systems by the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex doesn't talk to the reward center in an addict the same way it does in someone who hasn't used drugs of abuse. And in fact, that connection is now being considered as a metric for whether or not therapeutic interventions can work. fMRI has also been used to evaluate, I mentioned this, but I didn't show you the data, specifically what it is about a message that makes it remembered. And the best example that I can think about is a messaging campaign that was used to promote safe sex or safer sex. And in that case, what was discovered was that messages that were very evocative visually activated areas of the visual cortex, whereas the low intensity messages activated areas of the brain in the prefrontal and parietal cortex that are important for consolidating memories and evaluating what the person feels in response to the message. And so I think there's reason from other fields, such as lifestyle changes and changes with respect to addiction, that make us believe that we can in fact use fMRI to help design messages that would influence how somebody views what their incoming information regarding radicalization might be. But just thinking about what we would need to consider, we would need to consider some of the things that Dr. Rogan perhaps presented. Can we fight? Is there any kind of message that could be out there that could fight the person's need for significance and the possibility of gaining significance by joining one of these terrorist groups? That's a tough one. That's kind of a big thing to get. But it is possible perhaps to take smaller steps, eroding the trust of the people who are recruiting them. But again, that also is very difficult if the recruitment period starts when people are very young children in school.
So just if I thought, but with regard to outcome measures, it seems to be outcome measures that you're describing are those of assessment of areas of brain activation, whether it be addiction or habits and so on, as opposed to emitting messages and making change. In other words, getting people, in the examples used previously, getting them off drugs, getting them off smoking, to be then applied, say we've effectively used this as a treatment modality, not just an assessment modality, to get people's views to migrate away from radical behavior, migrate away from drug addiction, alcoholism.
So I'm not advocating fMRI as a treatment modality because of its limited access to centers everywhere, but I am advocating that it be used as a metric of whether or not a message is a good message.
Alex?
Can I ask a question here? I just wonder what sort of messages might be the magic bullet in such cases. For instance, if I look at my personal experiences, I once saw a documentary that there was a line in it. It said, each year 380,000 Europeans die prematurely from smoking. And at that moment I said, I'll be not one of them, and stopped. But half a year later I started again. But I remember one guy, a Danish rocker who became the supplier of blondes for Avlaki in Yemen. He was one day Googling on the internet contradictions in the Quran. Outwrote of a list of more than 180 contradictions. He read them. He was deradicalized. So what sort of messages do you have in mind?
Well, I think that's the purpose of our research. We would like to evaluate a wide series of messages in a wide variety of themes that appeal to individuals, and our goal is to tailor the message in such a way based on the source of the information and other factors. We'd like to figure out what it is that is the packaging of a message that makes the message relevant. And then we can work on what message we want to package.
Thank you very much. You want to add something?
Well,
Alex?
just a comment. I mean, if somebody would say the Pentagon's DARPA project have decided that this message will be important and effective against you, that packaging alone would already make the message counterproductive. So as interesting, intriguing these brain experiments are, I think we are just at the beginning of that. And given the fact that the advertisement industry that already manipulates us the way they do is behind it, it rather scares me.
I think that we need to use the work that the advertising industry is doing, and the advertising industry is now heavily involved in using fMRI in neuroeconomics and in also decision-making evaluation, and we'd like to use those tools and apply them to this very new application.
Well, the session is coming to an end. Most of you have to catch a bus, I guess. So please join me in thanking the speakers in this workshop for new ideas and reflections.
There's so much variability into what goes into